We all need to carry the torch of patriotism, and in Maryland, that is desperately needed. We will not be tread on anymore. Please join me in warmly welcoming Jared Taylor to the podium. Thank you so much.
Well, I'd certainly like to thank Colin McEvers for inviting me. He had a fair amount of opposition to doing so, not just from the Maryland Republican Party, but also from the university. The university itself said that my speaking here would be fundamentally inconsistent with the university's core values. Well, what I intend to do today is to state some utterly unambiguous facts, quote a few people word for word, and draw a few conclusions. How this is against anyone's core values is a mystery to me. The title of my talk is there a solution to the American race problem? I think we would all agree that there is unquestionably a race problem in the United States. And later on, I will give you some polling data to show that Americans broadly agree with me. There is a race problem, and it appears to be getting worse. Of course, the United States was inevitably going to have a race problem, because when Europeans came to North America, there was a group of people of another race who were already here. We then compounded the problem by bringing another racial group against its will to the United States, and then later on in the 20th century, we opened the door and let in everyone from everywhere, making the racial problems worse. This was not by any means the conception of the founders of the United States. In 1788, the United States Constitution was ratified. And in the very next year, we had the first Congress of the United States. This was a brand new country. A lot of important things had to be decided. For example, where were they going to put the capital? The first Congress set up the Secretary of the Department of State, Treasury, Department of War, the Postal Service. It passed the Bill of Rights. These people were laying the foundations for a new country. Something else equally important, not often noted, is that they had to decide who were going to be the citizens of this new country. And there was absolutely no recorded opposition to the first citizenship law in the United States, which reserved citizenship to free white persons of good character. The founders intended to have a white country. Now, what about black people? Of course, there were black people, enslaved black people, free black people. What was to be done with black people? Many of the slave owners agreed that slavery was a terrible injustice, but they thought it was equally appalling to think of liberating the slaves and then living together in the same society. Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, he had this image. He says, we hold the wolf by the ears. We can either hold him or let him go. That's a remarkable analogy. You've got the wolf by the ears. That's a dangerous situation. But they were afraid if they let the wolf loose in our society, that too would be dangerous. Now, Jefferson has a memorial right on the mall, and it has got many of his quotations engraved on that wall. And one of them is this. It says, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people, blacks, are to be free. That's where it stops in the Lincoln Memorial. That's not where Jefferson stopped. Jefferson continued on. He says, nor is it any less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. When that inscription was put on the wall, that was in effect a lie by omission. Thomas Jefferson wanted to free the slaves, that holding them in bondage was an injustice, but he said, when freed, The Negro is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. This was a very common idea at the time. The idea of freeing blacks and then moving them outside the country was called colonization. Abraham Lincoln, he's known to you, of course, as the great emancipator because he freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln was a great proponent, like many of the prominent Americans at this time, of colonization. Even during the American Civil War, here we are fighting a terrible, terrible war, but on his mind is the question, okay, once the slaves are free, what do we do with them? He appointed a fellow by the name of James Mitchell as Commissioner of Immigration, and he spent the whole war going around in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, looking for places where freed blacks could be sent. In 1862, this is while the war is going on, he arranged for the first time for a delegation of American blacks to visit the White House on official business. Blacks had been in the White House before as workmen or as servants, but this time they were there to meet the president, Abraham Lincoln. The transcript of that talk is easily available. And what Lincoln said to them is, look at what's happening in this country. White people slitting each other's throats. And it's because you are here. He said, please go back to your communities and ask your fellow blacks to pack your bags and leave. Now, at the time of the Civil War, the black population was 14%. It gradually declined through white immigration, and it was during this period in which the United States was overwhelmingly white that it enjoyed its period of greatest growth. By 1890, this overwhelmingly white nation had the largest GNP in the world. By the time of the First World War, it was a great power. By 1945, it was the world's #1 superpower. And likewise in the 1950s, during the period of America's greatest economic, military, and cultural power, it was overwhelmingly white, and deliberately so. Because until 1965, the United States had an immigration policy that was explicitly designed to keep the country European. That changed only due to a law called the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. We were competing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We were trying to influence people of the Third World. And it looked bad if people from around the world weren't even allowed to immigrate to the United States. And so when the Hart-Celler Immigration Act was proposed, its backers said, this is not going to be anything but a cosmetic measure. It's not going to change the racial mix of the United States. We will not have millions of people coming every year. Well, that turned out to be wrong. And I can assure you, if the Congress in 1965 had known that after passing that law, whites were going to be reduced from a 90% overwhelming majority to a minority just 70 or 80 years later, I can assure you they would never have passed that law. They expected whites to be a majority essentially forever. Whites were never asked, what do you think of this idea? Shall we put the thing in motion, turn you into a minority? Never asked. The idea that diversity is our strength, that is something that only cropped up in the 20th century, nearly 200 years after the founding of the United States. And as you know, when people talk about diversity, they may be talking about religion, they may be talking about language, but the most important thing they're talking about is race. And if we were to take this idea seriously, we should imagine, say, the 1950s. White Americans are about to choke to death on their own poisonous homogeneity. And yet, they were saved from this homogeneity by people from all around the world who brought this precious gift of diversity. What would we have become without all these wonderful people who came from all around the world? Now, the idea that diversity is a great and wonderful gift is an idea that is reserved exclusively for white countries. If you're a Frenchman and you say, well, I want France to remain French, well, boy, you must be a Nazi. But if you were to say to the Turks or the Japanese or the Indonesians, well, hey, diversity. No, you're not into the idea of diversity. Imagine going to China. You poke around for a while, and you spend some time in China, and after you've seen a thing or two, you say to your Chinese host, you know, not a bad country you have here, but you know, there's one really big problem. Too damn many Chinese. You need diversity. A couple of million Pakistanis, imagine that. Somalis are great. Yeah, bring in lots of Muslims. Bulgarians, they're exciting people. They would call in the men in white coats and have your head examined. They'd put you in a rubber room. And that would be the same for any non-white country. It's only white countries that are told, no, you can't remain a majority in your homeland. And I ask you, diversity, which is supposed to be a strength, sometimes we're told it's our greatest strength. How exactly is it a strength? Does it improve crop yields, stop global warming? Does it prevent tooth decay? If diversity of the kind we're supposed to be celebrating really were a wonderful, powerful strength, invigorating everything we do, why don't we at some point get just the right mix? So black people, Hispanics, Asians, white people, nudists, Buddhists, fruit juice drinkers, a few one-legged lesbian Indonesians, put them all in a room, you have real diversity. Now, wouldn't they find a cure for cancer? Wouldn't they solve the problem of nuclear fusion? Of course not. This nonsense about diversity is exactly that. Diversity is a source of conflict, a source of tension. The most obvious, of course, is race riots. You wouldn't have race riots if you didn't have a multiracial society. And it's not just that. The Oscars, are they too white? Are there enough Asian TV anchors? Are there enough black students in the Ivy League? Is the racial mix of the jury something that's going to result in justice? How about racial voting blocks? Everybody is out there pulling for his own group. Is that a strength? Obviously, a weakness. Why do we have a black congressional caucus? It's because your black representatives want to look at potential legislation and see, well, what's in it for the brothers? What's in it for us? That's why we have a Hispanic caucus. We have an Asian caucus. Better not have a white caucus because we're not supposed to have any interests. And this great strength, racial diversity, it is a source of conflict at all levels. Every year, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission gets 25,000 race discrimination cases brought to it every year. And these are only the ones that make it to the EEOC. Every one of these must be extremely disagreeable. And how about the ones that never make it there? On top of that, the federal courts see 3,000 federal cases of racial discrimination. State governments, universities, corporations, many of them, in fact, practically all of them, have these big clanking bureaucracies that try to manage what is supposed to be a wonderful thing, namely racial diversity. It has to be managed because it's a problem. Now, the American military is supposed to be a haven of racial good feeling. No racism in the military, right? Well, in 2017, there was a survey of active duty soldiers. And 31%, and the question was, have you been a victim of some kind of racial discrimination within the last year? 31% of blacks said yes. 21% of Hispanics said yes. 23% of Asians said yes, we have suffered racial discrimination. 9% of whites said yes. For a total of 216,000 cases of racial discrimination in this organization that's supposed to be a paragon of racial harmony.